The estate lawyer had used the phrase legal limbo. Adeline Pruitt wrote it down when he said it, not because she needed to, but because 31 years as a librarian had given her the habit of recording exact language when exact language mattered. Legal limbo. She looked at the two words on her notepad after she hung up the phone and understood that they described a condition without explaining a cause. A house in legal limbo had gotten there somehow. The how was the part nobody had bothered to explain. She bought Colston House anyway. At 69, Adeline had spent most of her adult life in the company of records, cataloging them, preserving them, teaching people how to read them carefully, and she had learned that the most important thing about any record was not what it said, but what it omitted. A deed that had never been properly recorded was not simply an administrative oversight. It was a gap, and gaps of that kind always had reasons. She intended to find the reason. The workers she hired for the structural assessment called her on a gray Tuesday morning. She had been expecting the call about the foundation. She had not been expecting the silence on the other end of the line before the crew chief finally spoke. "You need to come see this," he said. She was there in 35 minutes. They had removed the anomalous section of the east cellar wall, the rectangular patch of differently aged mortar she had noticed on her first walk through the stones, with the slightly sharper edges, the section that did not match the surrounding wall in color, texture, or era. Behind it was not a foundation cavity. Behind it was a passage. Adeline stood at the opening with her flashlight and looked into the dark. The tunnel was narrow and low-cut in stone, the floor leveled smooth by deliberate hands. It ran east beneath the mansion's main wing into a darkness that smelled of cold earth, dry lime, and the peculiar stillness of a sealed space that had been holding its breath for a very long time. She went in. At the far end, perhaps 40 feet from the cellar opening, the passage widened into a shallow alcove set back into the wall. The alcove itself had been bricked over with newer material than the surrounding stone, sealed with mortar that yielded under careful pressure in the way of something meant to be opened again, but only by the right person. Inside, centered on a stone shelf and wrapped in oilcloth tied with cord, gone stiff with age, was a tin box. Adeline lifted it out with both hands. It was lighter than she expected, and heavier than she expected at the same time, the strange weight of paper patience and something that had waited a very long time to be received. She carried it upstairs to the kitchen, set it on the table in the morning light, and opened the latch. The first thing she saw was a folded document. She unfolded it carefully. Read the property description. Read the legal language. And then found the name in the grantee field written in careful dark ink in letters slightly larger than the rest, as if the writer had understood that above everything else, this name needed to remain legible. Property of Vivienne Rose, Colston, September 4th, 1891. Adeline set the deed flat on the table and looked at the name. Not Edward Colston. Not Colston Estate. Vivienne Rose Colston. Someone had owned this house before the records stopped telling the truth. Someone had been erased from it. And if she had sealed the original deed in a tunnel beneath the mansion, then she had done it for a reason. Adeline looked at the name for a long moment. Then she reached back into the tin box. There was more. She did not rush getting out of the car. Adeline Pruitt sat behind the wheel for a long moment after she cut the engine, looking at Colston House through the windshield, the way she had always looked at a new acquisition before she touched it with full attention, without agenda, letting the thing present itself on its own terms before she imposed any categories on it. The house was stone. That was the first thing. Not brick, not frame-dressed stone. The courses laid with a precision that spoke to either significant resources or significant will, or both the corners dressed and true after 130 years of Virginia weather. 3 stories, the front elevation symmetrical, the arched doorways and windows giving the facade a quality of deliberate rhythm that she recognized from architectural history as a conscious choice rather than a period convention. Someone had thought carefully about how this building met the eye. The neglect was real, but not catastrophic. That was the second thing. Ivy had worked its way up the east elevation to the second-floor windows. The gravel drive had gone to weeds in its center. Two of the front shutters hung at angles that suggested hinge failure rather than storm damage, a slow deterioration, the kind that accumulated over years of simple absence. The house had not been destroyed. It had been left alone. There was a difference, and she knew how to read it. The estate lawyer had called 3 weeks earlier with the news that a distant relative, a man she had met exactly once at a family gathering a decade ago, whose name she had filed carefully in her memory without expecting to need it again, had died and left her this property. She had listened to the summary with her notepad open the way she listened to everything, and had asked 2 questions about the title status before the lawyer finished his explanation. He had paused before answering. "The title history is complicated," he had said. "It's changed hands 4 times since 1970. No one has lived there since. There are gaps in the recording chain that nobody has been able to fully account for." Another pause. "I want to make sure you understand what you're accepting before you sign." She had told him she would call him after she walked the property. She got out of the car now and stood on the gravel for a moment, her coat against the October cold, and looked at the house the way a librarian looked at an uncatalogued collection, not with sentiment, not with apprehension, but with the particular focused attention of someone who understood that the information was there and that the work was simply to find the right way to read it. She went inside. The front door opened on the 3rd attempt, the lock stiff with disuse, the door itself swollen slightly in its frame from years of unheated winters. The entry hall was wider than she had expected from the exterior proportions, the ceiling high enough to create a quality of space that felt intentional rather than incidental. The parquet floor beneath the dust was solid underfoot, the inlay pattern intact, the wood dried but not damaged. She tested it in 3 places before she was satisfied. Good joinery, good subfloor. Someone had built this floor to be walked on for generations. She moved through the ground floor methodically, the way she had always processed a new archive, established the scope, before examining any single item. The front parlor first high windows, arched door frames, plaster cracked at the upper corners but not failing. The lace curtains in the east parlor window were still hanging yellowed to the color of old paper, intact, in the way of things that had simply been left rather than disturbed. She touched one edge carefully. The fabric held. She stopped at the parlor walls. The blank rectangles were immediately visible, 6 of them at regular intervals around the room, each one a slightly lighter shade than the surrounding surface where a frame had protected the paint from a century of light and air. Not faded wallpaper, not water damage. The clean geometric outlines of pictures that had been removed, deliberately taken from their hooks by someone who had decided they should not remain. Removed, not lost. That was the distinction. She photographed each rectangle, 3 frames per wall section, making sure the outlines were legible in the images. Then she stood in the center of the parlor for a moment and looked at the 6 pale shapes, the 6 absences, and filed the question they raised in the same place she filed everything she did not yet have enough information to answer. Upstairs from the east landing window, she noticed the man at the gate. He was perhaps 80, standing at the iron gate where the drive met the road, both hands on the top rail, in the manner of someone who had been there long enough to need the support. He was looking at the house, not at her, not at the grounds, but at the house itself, the particular focused attention of someone who had a history with what they were looking at. He did not wave when she appeared in the window. He did not move toward the house. He simply stood and watched with the patient stillness of a man who had been waiting for something for a long time and had learned not to rush the waiting. She did not know who he was. She photographed him from the window, not intrusively at a distance, the gate and the road visible in the frame, and went back to her walk-through. She found the initials on her way down the main staircase. She had been running her hand along the underside of the banister, checking the joinery, feeling for the quality of the work beneath the visible surface the way she always examined significant millwork when her fingertips found the carving before her eyes did. She crouched on the 3rd step and angled her flashlight up. Small letters cut into the wood with care, not the casual marks of a child or a workman, but the deliberate inscription of someone who had chosen this location specifically. The underside of the banister, invisible from any standing angle, visible only to someone who thought to look from below. VRC 1891? She looked at the initials for a long moment. The cuts were clean and precise, the depth consistent throughout, the date placed beside the letters with the same care as the letters themselves. This was not impulse. This was someone marking something they had made in a place where the mark would last without being easily found. She photographed it carefully. 4 frames, different angles, the date legible in each one. Then she went to the basement. The foundation survey flag was where the workers had placed it, a small orange marker clipped to a nail in the east cellar wall, the notation on the flag reading mortar inconsistency, recommend assessment before close. She stood in front of the flag section and read the wall with the same attention she had brought to everything else. The inconsistency was visible once you knew to look for it. A rectangular section of the east wall approximately 2 feet wide and 3 feet tall, set at chest height, the mortar between these specific stones, a different color from the surrounding courses. Lighter, the texture slightly different, the age different. This section of wall had been opened and resealed, not recently, but not in the same century as the original construction. She put her palm flat against the stone. Cold. Solid. The wall was not compromised, the structural integrity was sound throughout, she could feel that immediately. But the air near the east corner was different from the air in the rest of the cellar. Drier, stiller. The particular quality of air near a sealed space that had not exchanged with the outside in a very long time. She crouched and brought the flashlight to the base of the flagged section. The mortar seam at the bottom ran in a clean horizontal line, too clean, too precise for a repair. Repairs followed damage. They were irregular, responsive, shaped by what had failed. This line was intentional. It was the base edge of a rectangle that had been formed, not found. Those stones had been moved and then reset by someone who understood exactly what they were doing and why and for how long the work needed to hold. If you want to know what's behind that cellar wall and whose initials are carved under this staircase, stay with me. A retired librarian did not buy a house without reading the footnotes. Adeline had thought of it in exactly those terms. On the drive to the county recorder's office, the title chain was the footnotes, the apparatus beneath the main text, the place where the qualifications and the omissions and the corrections lived. Anyone could read the main text. The footnotes required patience and a different kind of attention, the attention of someone who understood that what a document chose not to say was as significant as what it said directly. She had closed on the property that morning. The lawyer had looked slightly surprised when she signed without further questions. She had not told him she intended to spend the afternoon at the recorder's office. She did not think he would have found this reassuring. The county recorder's office was in the municipal building on the east side of the courthouse square. Linoleum floors, fluorescent lighting, the smell of paper stored in large quantities in spaces not entirely designed for it. She gave the clerk the property address and the parcel number she had taken from the survey and asked for the complete title chain, going back to original construction. The clerk returned with a folder of the kind that suggested a long and complicated history and set it on the counter without comment. Adeline opened it and worked from the oldest records forward. The earliest document was dated 1891. A construction deed, the standard form of the period, the property description matching the Colston House parcel, exactly all the correct fields completed in the formal hand of a county recording officer. The named owner in the grantee field was E. Colston. Edward, she assumed. A single initial and a surname, the convention of the period, efficient and uninformative. She turned to the next document. 1895, a transfer deed, grantor Colston Estate, grantee Ray Commercial Holdings, B. Ray Principal. She read the consideration amount once and then read it again because the figure seemed inconsistent with the property's evident scale. A 3-story dressed stone residence on several acres of Virginia land, transferred in 1895 for a number that did not reflect the cost of the construction she had walked through the day before. Not merely low implausible in the way of transactions where the recorded consideration concealed other arrangements or where the transfer had not been conducted at arm's length. She looked for an auction record. There was none. No probate filing in the folder, no court order authorizing the estate transfer. The Colston estate had transferred the property to Ray Commercial Holdings through what appeared on the surface of the documents to be a straightforward private sale, except that nothing about it was straightforward, and the records that should have surrounded a transaction of this significance were simply not there. She set the transfer deed aside and returned to the 1891 construction record. E. Colston. She read the document 3 times, looking for a second name, a joint ownership notation, any indication of a second party to the original deed. There was nothing. On paper in the county's official record, Edward Colston had built Colston House alone. She looked up at the clerk. "Is there a Vivian Colston anywhere in this chain, any document, any year?" The clerk typed for a moment, reviewed the results, typed again. "One mention," she said. She turned her monitor slightly so Adeline could read it. A city directory entry. 1892. Mrs. V. Colston. Colston Residence, Ashwood Hill. One line. A civic record of the most casual kind, the sort of directory that listed residents without legal weight or official standing. Mrs. V. Colston at the house on Ashwood Hill in 1892. And then the 1895 transfer deed. Her name not on it, not in the grantor field, not in any attached document, not in any marginal notation. Between 1892 and 1895, Vivian Rose Colston had been removed from the record of her own property as completely and deliberately as the portraits had been removed from the parlor walls. What remained in the official record was the clean geometric outline of her absence. Adeline photographed every page of the title chain and drove to the county archive. Claudia Trent had been the county archivist for 22 years and had the particular combination of precision and patience that distinguished people who had chosen their work rather than fallen into it. She was perhaps 57, her desk organized in the manner of someone who knew where everything was because she had decided where everything should be, and she listened to Adeline's summary with the focused attention of someone already running searches in her mind while the other person was still speaking. When Adeline finished, Claudia said, "Newspaper files, 1891 and 1892. She disappeared into the archive stacks and returned in 6 minutes with 2 bound volumes, the kind that held microfilm printouts organized by date. She set them on the reading table and opened the first to the 1891 index. They worked through the issues in order. The first relevant mention came in a spring 1891 Society column, a brief notice about a gathering held at Mrs. Vivian Colston's remarkable new residence on Ashwood Hill, the house described in the admiring shorthand the county paper reserved for properties it considered worthy of its readers' attention. Her name, in print, in 1891. Claudia found the second mention in the summer of 1892, a charity event, Mrs. Vivian Colston as the named hostess, the residence described again with the same particular admiration. And a third in the autumn of the same year, a musical evening, Vivian Colston's name in the first sentence of the notice. 3 references, 3 separate occasions. The county newspaper had named her consistently, had credited her with the residents, consistently had understood without apparent question that the house on Ashwood Hill belonged to Vivian Colston, and that she was the appropriate person to name when the house was mentioned. Claudia set the 3 clippings in a line on the reading table between them. "The construction deed shows only Edward," she said. Her voice was even the tone of someone presenting evidence rather than argument. "But every society reporter in this county knew it was hers. They wrote her name, they wrote her house. 3 times in 2 years, and then the transfer happens and she disappears from the record entirely." Adeline looked at the 3 clippings and then at the title chain photographs on the table beside them. The newspaper record and the official record told 2 entirely different stories about the same property, and the official record was the one that had survived as legal fact, while the newspaper record had sat in an archive for 130 years, waiting for someone to ask for it. Between 1893 and 1895, Adeline said quietly more to herself than to Claudia. Someone rewrote the record. Claudia did not answer immediately. She had reached for the 1895 transfer deed from Adeline's folder and was holding it under the archive lamp, tilting it at the angle of someone examining a specific detail rather than reading the general content. She was quiet for a moment. Then, Edward Colston died in November 1893. She set the document flat on the table and looked at Adeline across the reading lamp. This transfer deed is dated February 1895. The archive room was very still. That, Claudia said, with the careful precision of someone who had spent 22 years handling documents and understood exactly what she was looking at, is not his signature. The call came on a Thursday morning. Adeline had been at the kitchen table of her apartment with the title chain photographs spread in front of her, and Claudia's notes from the archive beside them, working through the sequence of events between Edward Colston's death in November 1893 and the transfer deed dated February 1895. She had a legal pad with a timeline on it, dates in the left margin, documented facts in the center column, questions in the right column. The questions column was considerably longer than the facts column, which was how she knew she was still in the early stages of understanding something. Her phone rang at 9:20. The crew chief's name was Robert. He was a man of economical speech, the kind who had learned through long experience that unnecessary words on a job site created confusion rather than clarity. He had called her twice before during the assessment, once about the east wing roofline and once about a drainage issue near the foundation's north corner. Both times he had described the situation in 3 sentences and waited for her response. This time he said 4 words. "Ms. Pruitt, come see this." She called Claudia from the car. Claudia was at Colston House before Adeline arrived, which told her that Claudia had also been waiting for this call, or something like it, since the afternoon they had sat across from each other in the archive, with the forged transfer deed between them. She was standing at the side entrance with her canvas bag and 2 battery lanterns when Adeline pulled up the drive, and she fell into step beside her without preamble. Robert met them at the cellar stairs. The flagged section of the east wall was gone. He and his crew had removed it in the morning's first hours carefully, each stone numbered in chalk on its face. Before extraction, the pieces set aside in sequence against the opposite wall. The opening they had revealed was not a foundation cavity or a utility access or a structural void. It was a passage. Adeline stood at the opening and held her flashlight beam into the dark for a long moment before she stepped through. The passage was narrow wide enough for one person moving deliberately, the ceiling low enough to require a slight forward angle of the head throughout. The walls were hand-cut stone, dressed with care, the tool marks visible in the lantern light as she entered. She ran her fingertips along the left wall and felt the quality of the cutting precise, practiced the work of someone who knew stone and had taken time with it. The construction was older than the cellar walls behind her. She understood this immediately from the character of the stone, the style of the dressing, the particular way the courses had been laid. This passage had not been built when the house above it was built. It had been built first, and the house had been constructed over it. Claudia entered behind her with the second lantern. Neither of them spoke. The passage ran east beneath the mansion's main wing, the direction consistent with the building's footprint. Adeline counted her steps. The floor was level stone, smooth, and even without the irregularity of a natural surface, it had been laid deliberately finished with the same care as the walls. She looked for pipes along the wall faces, for drainage channels cut into the floor, for any evidence of the functional infrastructure that would have justified building a tunnel of this quality beneath a residential property. There was nothing! No pipes, no drainage, no utility purpose of any kind. The walls were smooth throughout, not rough cut for access, not utilitarian in any respect, but finished with an attention that matched the craftsmanship of the rooms above. Someone had built this passage with the same intention they brought to the arched doorways and the calibrated window placements and the parquet floors. It had been designed for a specific purpose that had nothing to do with plumbing or drainage or the mechanical needs of a large house. The lantern light moved across the walls in slow arcs as they walked. Claudia said nothing. Adeline said nothing. The silence felt appropriate, not the silence of unease, but the silence of people who understood. They were inside something that had been built to last and to be found, and that deserved the respect of full attention. The passage ended at approximately 40 feet from the cellar entrance. The right wall at the far end widened slightly, not dramatically, just enough to create a niche set back from the tunnel's main line, a deliberate architectural gesture in a space where nothing was accidental. The walls of the niche were brick, not stone. Different material, different era added after the tunnel's original construction by someone who had come into this finished passage and built something additional within it. Adeline stood in front of the niche and looked at it before touching anything. The brickwork was set at a specific height. This registered before anything else not at floor level, not at the height of a utility installation or a storage shelf, at approximately 5 feet from the ground, standing height for a woman of average stature. The height at which a person could reach comfortably, could place something with care, could retrieve it without difficulty. The placement had not been chosen for convenience. It had been chosen for a person. She looked at the mortar. It was harder in some sections and softer in others, not from age differential, but from application method. The softer sections were at the face of the brickwork, creating a seal that presented as permanent from the front, but that had been applied without packing behind. She understood this without needing to test it. She had catalogued enough 19th century construction to recognize the difference between mortar, meant to hold indefinitely, and mortar meant to hold until the right hands arrived. She took the small pry tool Robert had left at the tunnel entrance and worked it gently into the left edge of the niche face. The first brick came away cleanly, too cleanly for a seal that had not been designed to yield. The fit was precise, the face mortar releasing without taking the surrounding material with it, the brick intact and undamaged. She removed the second brick with the same result, then the third. The opening was sufficient. She held the lantern to the space behind. The alcove was shallow, perhaps 15 inches deep, the walls stone, the floor, stone, the surfaces smooth and dry in the way of a space that had been sealed against the outside completely, and had held that seal without failure. The air that came out when the bricks were removed was cold and still preserved air, the particular stillness of a closed space that had not exchanged with the outside world since the day it was shut. Inside the alcove centered on the stone floor of the niche, wrapped in oilcloth, tied with a length of cord that had dried to the color of pale rope, a tin box. Rectangular document storage proportions, the olive paint of the oilcloth wrapping intact throughout. The cord had dried but not crumbled. The oilcloth had not cracked. The seal had held for 132 years in a dry stone alcove, in a sealed tunnel beneath a house whose legal record omitted the name of the woman who had built it, and the preservation was complete. Adeline crouched in the low space of the alcove and lifted the box with both hands. Lighter than she expected in the way of paper and patience. Something shifted inside as she lifted the subtle movement of multiple documents loose within the box, rearranging themselves slightly as the angle changed. More than one. She held it level and carried it with both hands the way she had always carried fragile things, not clutching, not rushing, simply holding steadily and moving with care, back through the 40 feet of passage, up the stone steps, through the cellar and up the main stairs and into the east parlor where the morning light came through the 3 windows, the center one slightly larger than the flanking 2, positioned to catch the light at a specific angle that she now understood had been calculated rather than approximate, and fell across the floor in long, warm rectangles. She set the box on the parlor table directly in the light. She wiped the oilcloth clean with the cloth she had brought in her bag slowly from the center outward, the way she had always cleaned archival materials before examination, not from ceremony, but from the simple discipline of seeing clearly without interference. The tin beneath was intact. A single flat latch at the front, no lock mechanism. The latch opened cleanly. She lifted the lid. Inside a folded document lying flat across the top of the stack, the topmost paper in a collection of several. The oilcloth inner wrapping had preserved the top edge, which was exposed when the lid came up, and the words written there in careful copperplate ink were fully legible in the morning light without requiring her to unfold the page. 4 words. Property of Vivian Rose Colston. Adeline looked at the name for a long time without speaking. Claudia stood on the other side of the table and looked at it with her. Outside the east parlor window, the October light moved across the lawn in the slow way of late-season mornings, unhurried, indifferent to what had just been found at the table it was crossing. Neither of them moved for a long moment. Then Adeline reached into the box. She cleared a space on the parlor table before she began. Not from ceremony, from the same professional habit that had governed 31 years of archival work. A clear surface, good light, adequate space between items so that nothing competed with anything else for attention. She moved her bag to the floor beside her chair, set her notepad open to a fresh page, and positioned herself at the east window where the morning light fell flat and even and without shadow across the table's surface. Claudia sat across from her and said nothing. They had established this without discussion, the same silence they had brought to the tunnel, the same understanding that what was in this box had waited long enough that it deserved to be received without hurry. Adeline reached into the tin box and removed the contents one at a time, setting each item to the right of the box in the order it had been placed, which she understood was the order Vivienne had intended them to be found. The deed first. She had read the first 4 words when she opened the lid. Now she unfolded the document fully and read it completely, in order from the first line, the county header, the property description, the legal language of first ownership, every field and every line, before she allowed herself to reach the name again. The property description matched the Colston House parcel exactly. The date was September 4th, 1891. The deed was a document of original ownership establishing legal title at the moment of first occupancy, the foundational record from which all subsequent transfers should have derived. The named owner in the grantee field was Vivienne Rose Colston. Her full name, not E. Colston, not the Colston family, not a joint tenancy with her husband's name preceding hers. Vivienne Rose. Colston alone in the grantee field of the original construction deed in the careful copperplate hand of a county recording officer who had written what the document required, and nothing else. Edward Colston's name was not on this deed, not as co-owner, not in any supporting capacity, not in any field on either page. On the day Colston House was legally established as a property with an owner, that owner had been one person. Adeline set the deed to the right and reached into the box. The second item was a roll of papers tied with a narrow ribbon, pale blue, faded toward gray with age, the bow still holding after 130 years in a sealed alcove. She untied it with careful fingers and unrolled the papers slowly, holding the edges flat against the table with her palms as the curl of long storage resisted hers. Architectural drawings, 6 sheets on drafting paper that had kept its integrity in the dry cold of the tunnel firm, pale, the surface slightly textured in the way of period drafting stock. She recognized the technique immediately, pencil construction lines beneath ink final, rendering the standard method of the period, the pencil still faintly visible beneath the ink as a record of the work's process. These were not presentation drawings prepared for a client's approval. They were working drawings used during construction. She could see it in the worn edges, the marginal notations, the small corrections made in a different ink where a measurement had been revised. She looked at the date on the first sheet, 1889, the second, 1889, the third, 1890, the fourth and fifth, 1891, the sixth, a site plan showing the building's footprint and the approach drive, and the mature tree line rendered in careful strokes, 1891, with a notation in the lower margin she read twice before she was satisfied she had parsed it correctly. Foundation survey complete. Ready for superstructure. First stone, April 14th. In the lower right corner of each drawing, in the same careful copperplate hand as the deed. Colston. Adeline set the drawings in a sequence across the table and looked at them for a moment. Then she stood and walked to the east wall of the parlor. The window arch, the central window of the 3 that faced east, the one positioned to catch the morning light at the specific angle she had noticed on her first walk-through, as being too precisely calibrated to be accidental. She found the interior elevation drawing from 1890 and held it beside the window. The arch radius was drawn there exactly the same proportion, the same meeting angle at the side walls annotated in Vivienne's hand with a single measurement and a note she had to read twice the eye before the light. Let the arch frame what the window finds. She walked to the staircase and crouched at the third step, angling her flashlight up at the underside of the banister. VRC, 1891. She found the staircase plan in the 1890 drawings, the curve drawn with a compass, the radius marked, the banister profile detailed in a separate inset, at the lower left corner of the sheet, signed again in the corner. Va E.V. Colston. She went back to the table and sat down. Vivian Rose Colston had not commissioned this house. She had designed it. She had drafted 6 sheets of working drawings across 2 years, beginning in 1889, when she was 26 years old, carrying the design from initial concept through final construction documents with the methodical precision of someone who knew exactly what she was building and why. She had stood on this ground before the foundation was poured and made decisions about arches and window placements and staircase curves that were still standing, still functioning, still doing exactly what she had calculated they would do 132 years later. The initials under the banister were not a mark of ownership. They were a signature. Adeline reached into the box for the third item, a contract. Printed on heavy legal paper, the typeface of a commercial document prepared by a law office, the format of a formal business partnership agreement. She read the header, Edward Colston and Burton Ray entered into partnership this 14th day of August, 1893. She read through the standard partnership language, capital contributions, management responsibilities, profit distribution, the terms of the commercial venture they were entering. She read it clause by clause, the way she read all legal documents, without skipping, without assuming that the significant content would announce itself. She found it in Clause 9. It was on the 4th page in the middle of a dense paragraph about security interests and partnership obligations, written in the compressed legal prose of the period, the kind of language that required active parsing to understand, and that could be read without full comprehension by someone moving through it quickly or trusting the person who had prepared it, including all real property registered to the Colston estate as collateral security for outstanding partnership liabilities. All real property registered to the Colston estate. Edward Colston had signed his wife's house, the house she had designed at 26, the house she had financed and built and carved her initials into a business partnership agreement as collateral security 4 months before he died. Whether he had read Clause 9 with the attention it required, whether he had understood that the house was in Vivian's name and grasped what pledging it against partnership liabilities meant, whether Burton Ray had explained the clause to him or had buried it deliberately in dense legal language on page 4, the document was silent on all of this. Documents recorded signatures not understanding. Edward Colston died in November 1893. Burton Ray had filed the transfer deed 15 months later. Adeline set the contract beside the deed and looked at both together. Then she reached into the box for the 4th item, a single sheet of paper folded once. Vivian's hand, she recognized it now from the architectural drawings, the same copper plate precision but different in character, less formal, the writing of a person not preparing a document, but recording something before it could be lost, before the weight of what had happened pressed it out of existence entirely. No date. Written after Edward died, she understood this before she read the first word from the quality of the writing itself, the particular pressure of someone recording facts under conditions that made recording difficult. She read it slowly. Edward did not understand what he signed. He was not a careful reader of legal language, and he trusted Burton as he trusted everyone. I was not told until Mr. Ray arrived at the door with the transfer papers. I have no legal recourse. A line break. Then separated from the first paragraph by a space that felt deliberate, as if Vivian had stopped and looked at what she had written and understood that the practical account was not sufficient. I am recording this here so that someone will know. I built this house. It was mine. I want it known. Adeline read it once. Then she read it again without moving, without speaking, without looking up from the page. She had spent 31 years in the company of documents, cataloging the records of other people's lives, preserving what others had made and said and decided, understanding, in the accumulated practice of that work, that documents were not abstractions, but residue. What people had actually done, actually intended, actually understood, about their own lives left behind in paper and ink for anyone patient enough to read it carefully. Vivian Rose Colston had designed this house at 26 years old, had drafted every room, every arch, every window, had financed it, overseen its construction, signed her initials into the wood of the banister where they would last, and had then been removed from it, her name stripped from every official record, her credit erased from every legal document, replaced by the name of a business arrangement she had never consented to, by a clause buried on page 4 of a contract her husband had not read carefully enough. She looked at the architectural drawings spread across the table. She looked at the east window arch that Vivian had drawn in 1889 and that was still standing in the wall behind her, still framing the morning light at the angle Vivian had calculated. She looked at the room she was sitting in. Then she looked toward the east window. Norbert Ray was at the iron gate. He had been there every morning since she arrived. Same post, same stillness, the particular careful watchfulness of a man who had been waiting for something for a long time and was now watching it happen from a careful distance, not sure whether to be relieved or afraid. Burton Ray's grandson. She looked at him for a long moment across the distance of the lawn and the morning light. She understood now why he kept coming back. He had not come to claim anything. He had come because he could not stay away from what his grandfather had done, and he had not yet found a way to say so to anyone who could receive it. Have you ever found something in an old house, an old box, a document that made you see the whole story completely differently? Tell me in the comments. She walked to the gate alone. She had not told Claudia she was going. Claudia was at the parlor table with the tin box contents and her notepad, working through the partnership agreement clause by clause with the focused attention of an archivist who had found something significant and was making sure she understood it completely. Adeline had simply stood put on her coat and gone out through the front door and across the lawn in the October morning, the gravel quiet under her feet, the old oak near the gate moving slightly in a wind that carried the particular coldness of a season, changing its mind about warmth. Norbert Ray saw her coming. He had been leaning on the top rail of the iron gate, both hands resting there in the manner of a man who had been standing in one place long enough to need the support. When he saw her cross the lawn toward him, he straightened slowly, not quickly, not with any show of composure, but with the deliberate care of a man bracing for something he had been bracing for in one form or another for a very long time. He did not leave. That was the thing she noticed first and held on to. He had had 3 days to leave. He had stood at this gate every morning for 3 days watching, and he had not left. A guilty man with nothing but guilt would have left. Norbert Ray had stayed because leaving was no longer something he was capable of after 58 years of a particular kind of caring. She stopped on her side of the gate. She did not introduce herself. He knew who she was. She did not accuse him of anything because she had not come to the gate to accuse anyone. She had come because she understood from the way he had been standing at this gate for 3 days that he had something he needed to put down and had not yet found the right hands to put it into. She reached into her coat pocket and unfolded one of the architectural drawings she had brought with her, the 1890 interior elevation, the east parlor wall, with the window arch drawn precisely in Vivian's hand, the signature V. Colston in the lower right corner. She held it up so he could see it across the gate. "Do you know whose initials are carved under the main staircase banister?" she said. Norbert looked at the drawing for a moment. He said, "Just that word. No hesitation, no qualification, no reaching for a more comfortable answer. A single syllable delivered with the flatness of a man who had stopped pretending about certain things a long time ago. The wind moved through the oak above them. A few leaves came down unhurried, the slow descent of late October. Neither of them spoke for a long moment. Then Norbert said, "I was 21 years old when I found my grandfather's papers." He said it the way people begin confessions they have been composing for years, not from the beginning of the story, but from the moment that mattered most, the fulcrum point around which everything else had arranged itself. "I was going through his estate. My father had died the year before. It was just me." He paused. "I read everything. I didn't understand all of it at first. I was 21. I understood enough." He looked at the house over her shoulder. At the stone facade, the arched windows, the east elevation that Vivienne had drawn in her first site plan in 1889 when she was 26 years old. "I'm 79 now," he said. 58 years. She did the arithmetic without meaning to the same reflex that had made her count her steps in the tunnel and note the dates on the architectural drawings and read every clause of the partnership agreement before she allowed herself to form a conclusion. 58 years of carrying something across all the different shapes. A life takes youth, middle age, the long deceleration toward the end of it, watching it change form in different seasons without ever changing its fundamental weight. Some years it felt like guilt, Norbert said. He was not looking at her as he spoke. He was looking at the house the way he had been looking at it for 3 days, and the house was receiving his attention with the same patient indifference it had shown everything for 130 years. Some years I could arrange it differently. The house had been in my family for 60 years by the time I found the papers. My grandfather was dead. My father was dead. No one living had done the thing. And the house had it provided. For my family, for my children. A pause. I found ways to tell myself that what had already happened was simply history. He looked at his hands on the gate rail. Some years it was just weight with no name. That was the worst kind. He was not a monster. She had understood this from the third morning she had seen him at the gate, not the first, when she had simply noted him as an unknown figure, and not the second when she had begun to form a theory about who he was, but the third, when she had watched him from the upstairs window long enough to see the quality of his stillness. A monster did not stand at a gate for 3 days. A monster drove away and did not return. What Norbert Ray had inherited was not malice, but consequence, the long downstream accumulation of a wrong committed before he existed, that he had benefited from every day of his adult life without having chosen it and without having found a way to put it down. "My grandfather wrote a letter to his lawyer in 1895, Norbert said, after the transfer was filed. I've read it more times than I can count. He stopped. I have never found a way to make it mean something other than what it means. He pushed himself away from the gate and walked to his car, a dark blue sedan parked on the road's shoulder, the same car she had seen there every morning. He opened the back door and reached inside. He returned carrying a flat wooden box. Old, the wood darkened with age and handling the surface worn smooth at the corners and along the top edge where hands had lifted it and set it down over many years. A simple latch, the kind that required no key. He carried it with both hands level with the particular care of someone transporting something fragile, not in its material, but in its meaning. He held it across the gate to her. She took it. "Burton Ray's private papers," he said. "Everything he kept that the lawyers didn't take. I've had this box since I was 21 years old." She set the box on the top of the gatepost and opened the latch. Inside a small collection of documents organized by someone Norbert she assumed at some point in 58 years of living with this box into a sequence that told a story in order. The 1895 transfer deed, the forged version Burton Ray's copy, his own signature on the grantor line alongside the dead man's name. A letter from a lawyer's office dated March 1895, printed on the firm letterhead. She read the relevant line. "The widow has removed herself from the district. The matter is fully resolved." She read it again. The widow. Not Mrs. Colston, not Vivienne. The widow. The category, not the person, the legal designation that had replaced the name of the woman who had designed the house and built it and carved her initials into its banister and sealed her deed in oilcloth in a tunnel alcove and waited 132 years for someone to find it. The matter is fully resolved. Beneath the lawyer's letter folded separately a smaller piece of paper, personal stationery, the kind used for private correspondence rather than official communication. Burton Ray's hand she assumed older than the legal documents, the writing slightly less controlled. No date, no salutation, never sent. She came to the door the morning after I filed. I did not answer. She sat on the step for nearly an hour. Then she left. Adeline held the paper for a moment. Vivienne Rose Colston had come to the door of her own house the morning after the fraudulent transfer was filed. had sat on the step of the house she had designed at 26 and built with her own resources, and lived in and loved and been taken from, had sat there for nearly an hour while Bert and Ray stood inside and did not answer. Then she had left, and gone somewhere to what life under what circumstances the document did not say, and sealed her deed in a tunnel alcove and trusted that someone would find it. Adeline set the papers back in the wooden box and closed the latch. She looked at Norbert across the gate. He was watching her with the expression of a man who has handed something heavy to another person, and is not yet sure whether the transfer has actually occurred, whether the weight has genuinely moved, or whether it will return to him when he wakes in the morning. "I've been waiting," he said quietly, "for someone who would know what to do with this." He looked at the house one more time. "I'm 79 years old. I've waited long enough." A pause. Then half to himself the question he had probably been forming for 58 years without knowing who to ask. Is there anything left in that house with her name on it? Anything they didn't take? Adeline thought of the banister. The third step. The flashlight angled up from below. The careful letters cut into the wood where no one standing would ever see them in the location, chosen by someone who understood that a signature needed to be protected to last. "Yes," she said. She told him about the carving. VRC 1891, the underside of the banister, the clean, precise cuts of someone who knew how to use a blade and had chosen the location with intention. Norbert closed his eyes. He held them closed for a long moment, long enough that the wind moved through the oak above them again, long enough that 2 more leaves came down and settled on the gravel between them. When he opened them, his face had changed. Not relief. Relief would have been too simple, too clean, too immediate for a weight that had been carried for 58 years in different shapes through different seasons. What she saw instead was something more gradual, the particular expression of a burden that has not been lifted but has finally been transferred to ground that can hold it. The weight settling into a different shape, a shape that had a place to rest. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Then Adeline picked up the wooden box from the gatepost and tucked it under her arm. "Come inside," she said. "There's someone you should meet." Claudia looked up when Adeline came through the parlor door. She had been at the table with her notepad and the partnership agreement working through the legal language of Clause 9 with the systematic attention of someone who wanted to understand every implication before she moved to the next question. When she saw the wooden box under Adeline's arm and Norbert Ray in the doorway behind her, she set her pen down and said nothing. She simply looked at the two of them and waited. Adeline set the wooden box on the table beside the tin box. She introduced Norbert briefly, Burton Ray's grandson, she said, and left the rest for the documents to explain. Norbert sat in the chair nearest the door, the chair of someone who was not sure how long he was staying and wanted to keep his options available. He folded his hands in his lap and looked at the 2 boxes on the table with the expression of a man who has carried something for 58 years and has just watched it arrive at its destination. Adeline and Claudia worked the way archivists work. They removed everything from both boxes and laid it across the table in a sequence, not by box, not by provenance, but by date, the chronological order that revealed the shape of a life, rather than the shape of 2 separate collections. The earliest document on the left, the latest on the right, and everything between, arranged so that the story they told could be read from beginning to end without jumping between sources. Claudia had brought her own materials from the archive photocopies of the newspaper, mentions the city directory entries, the county birth and property records she had pulled in the 2 days since their first meeting. She added these to the sequence on the table, fitting them into the gaps between the documents from the boxes, and when she was finished, the table held the most complete account of Vivian Rose Colston's life that had existed anywhere since 1895. They began to read it together. Vivian had been born in 1863, the only child of a merchant family in the county seat. A careful man, her father, who had kept records of everything and had left her at his death in 1887, a carefully documented inheritance that gave her both the means and the legal independence to act on her own account. She had been 24 when her father died and 26 when she began the architectural drawings for Colston House. The drawings themselves told part of the story. Adeline had looked at them as architectural documents in the parlor on the first morning. Now she read them differently as biographical evidence. The pencil construction lines in the margins of every sheet were Vivian's alone, not a draftsman's corrections, not a builder's notations. The handwriting was consistent throughout, the same hand as the deed, and the personal note, the measurements written in the same copperplate as her signature. She had not hired an architect and approved his drawings. She had conceived the building herself, drafted the working documents herself, and engaged a local builder to execute what she had already fully designed. The builder's name appeared in a single newspaper notice from 1890, a brief mention of the construction progress on Mrs. Edward Colston's remarkable new residence. Mrs. Edward Colston. Her identity filtered through her husband's name in every public record, every social notice, every casual mention in a county paper that had not yet developed the habit of asking women what they wished to be called. But the pencil marks in the margins of the drawings were hers alone. No newspaper convention could reach the margins of a working drawing. Claudia found the post-1895 city directory entries and laid them in sequence on the table. 1896 V. Colston Room, Let Garnett Street. The same address appeared in every subsequent directory she had found year after year through the 1900s and 1910s and 1920s. One address. A rented room on Garnett Street shared the directory notation indicated a boarding arrangement with another woman whose name changed twice across the decades, suggesting that Vivian had stayed while others came and went around her. 36 years. From the house she had designed and built at 26, the arched doorways, the calibrated window light, the parquet floors she had specified in the construction notes, to a rented room on Garnett Street for 36 years, until she died. Claudia had the death record. She had pulled it from the county vital records archive and printed it and brought it in her canvas bag, and had not yet shown it to Adeline, waiting for the right moment in the sequence. She set it on the table now in its correct chronological position at the end of the line. 1931. Vivian Rose Colston. Age 68. Cause of death pneumonia. Occupation seamstress. Property none. Claudia read it aloud. Then she set it down. The parlor was very quiet. Seamstress. Property none. The official reduction of a woman who had designed a 3-story dressed stone residence at 26, who had specified window arches and fireplace proportions and staircase curves that were still standing and still functioning more than a century after she drew them, reduced in the county's final accounting to an occupation and an absence. Adeline stood up from the table. She walked through the parlor slowly, the way she had walked through the house, on the first morning, methodically, without rushing, letting the space present itself. But she was reading it differently now. She stopped at the east doorway and looked at the arch, the radius Vivian had drawn in 1890, the meeting angle she had annotated with the instruction, "Let the eye rise before the foot does." She stood in the arch for a moment. She walked to the fireplace and stood in front of it, centered exactly on the north wall as the drawing showed. The proportions of the surround, the height, the width, the depth of the opening specified in Vivian's hand in the 1891 construction notes and executed without deviation. She crossed to the east window. The morning light came through it at the angle Vivian had calculated 32 years before she sealed the tin box in the tunnel alcove. Adeline sat in the chair nearest the window, the chair that faced the light, directly the chair that received what Vivian had designed the window to give. She sat in it and looked at the light for a long moment without speaking. Then quietly, to no one in particular, and to the room itself. She didn't lose this house. It was taken from her. She knew no one would believe her, so she left the proof where someone would have to go looking. Norbert in the chair by the door looked at the floor. Claudia looked at the death record on the table, then at the architectural drawings beside it. The same table, the same morning light, the document that recorded the end of Vivian's life, lying against the drawings she had made at the beginning of it. Seamstress. Property none. Beside V. Colston, September 4th, 1891, the deed that proved what had been hers. Claudia looked toward the cellar doorway. It was still open. From the parlor at this angle, the top of the cellar steps was visible, and beyond them the darkness of the passage that ran east beneath the house, the passage that had been there since before the house existed, sealed and dry and patient for 132 years. She came back, Claudia said, after 1895, after it was already over, after the transfer was filed, after she had no legal standing, after she had moved to a rented room on Garnett Street. She paused. She came back to this house and she went down into that tunnel and she sealed those documents in the alcove herself. She looked at Adeline. Why would she do that? Why would she go to that trouble in a house that was no longer hers, sealing a deed in a tunnel no one knew about, unless she believed completely and without doubt that someone would come? The parlor held the question without answering it. The morning light continued across the floor in its slow way, moving through the east window that Vivian had drawn into every draft of this house from the very first sheet in 1889, always positioned to catch exactly this light at exactly this angle, as if she had known even then that the most important thing a window could do was make sure that whatever happened in the room below, it happened in good light. Vivian's story isn't finished yet, and neither is Ada's. Subscribe, we're almost at the end and the last part matters most. Claudia went back into the tunnel the following morning. She had told Adeline the night before that she wanted to photograph the alcove properly before they moved forward with any formal documentation. Archival standards required a complete photographic record of a find in situ, and the previous day's discovery had moved too quickly for that kind of systematic work. Adeline had agreed and gone home to her apartment with Norbert's wooden box and the tin box and the architectural drawings spread across her kitchen table, working through them again in the way she worked through everything significant a second pass, slower than the first, looking for what the first pass had missed. She was at Colston House by 8. Claudia had already been in the tunnel for 20 minutes when she called up. Her voice came from below with the particular quality of sound in stone passages, slightly flattened, the resonance dampened by the walls. But the quality of the voice itself was distinct, not alarmed, careful in the way of someone who has found something and is choosing their words before they speak. Ada, there's a second recess. Adeline went down the cellar stairs and through the passage with her lantern moving at the same careful pace she had used the first time. Claudia was crouched at the left wall of the alcove, her own lantern angled low, the beam directed at a section of the wall that Adeline had passed without examining on the first search, a lower section set perhaps 18 inches from the floor, slightly left of the main niche and partially obscured by the fallen corner of the oilcloth, wrapping from the tin box which had shifted when Adeline lifted the box and settled against the wall in a way that covered the lower recess almost entirely. She crouched beside Claudia and looked. A smaller niche set into the wall at a lower height than the main alcove, not at standing woman height, but at the height of someone crouching or kneeling or setting something down with particular care, close to the ground. The brickwork ceiling it was the same as the main alcove, the same mortar, the same era applied with the same method of face sealing, rather than packing behind. Smaller opening, perhaps 8 inches wide and 6 inches tall. Adeline worked the mortar with the pry tool. The bricks came away in the same manner as before, cleanly the face seal releasing without resistance, the opening revealing a shallow space behind. Inside a square of muslin cloth folded carefully around something small and firm. She lifted it out with both hands and unwrapped it slowly, the muslin dry and intact, the folds still holding their creases from whenever Vivian had pressed them. Inside the muslin a portrait photograph in an oval brass frame. Small, the kind meant for a bedside table or a writing desk, personal in scale rather than formal. The glass was intact. Behind it, printed on the heavy cardstock of a professional portrait from the early 1890s, a photograph of a woman. Adeline held the lantern close. The woman was standing at the front entrance of Colston House. She could see the dressed stone of the facade behind the figure and above, and to the right, unmistakably, the arch of the east parlor window. The woman was young, early 30s, perhaps. The age Vivian would have been circa 1892, a year before Edward died, 2 years before the transfer. She was dressed carefully, her posture straight, her hands at her sides. She was looking directly into the camera with an expression that Adeline studied for a long time before she was satisfied she had read it correctly. Not smiling, not frightened, not performing anything for the photographer or for whoever might eventually look at this image. Composed, certain. The expression of a woman who understood exactly where she was standing and had chosen to be photographed there in front of this specific doorway, with this specific window visible behind her, because she wanted the record to show what she was standing in front of and who she was when she stood there. Adeline carried the portrait upstairs without speaking. Claudia followed. In the east parlor in the morning light, Claudia found a soft cloth in her canvas bag, and they cleaned the brass frame carefully, the tarnish of 130 years coming away. Slowly the brass beneath warming as the cloth worked across it. The glass they left as it was. The photograph was fully legible through it, and the glass had protected it, and they did not touch what did not need to be touched. Adeline carried the portrait to the fireplace. She set it on the mantel centered above the firebox that Vivian had drawn into every draft of this house from the 1889 first sketch onward, insisting on it in every revision, the annotation in the 1890 drawings reading simply warmth at the center and nothing more. She stepped back and looked at the portrait on the mantel of the fireplace in the parlor of the house Vivienne had built. Vivienne looked back, composed, certain. Adeline drove to the municipal cemetery that afternoon, the east section. Claudia had found the burial record that morning, a Standard County interment, 1931, the plot number noted in the register. She found the grave without difficulty. A flat stone, regulation size, the standard issue of a burial, without resources for anything more particular. 2 dates, a name. Vivienne Rose Colston. 1863 to 1931. No occupation, no words, no record of anything she had made or done or built or lost. The stone recorded her existence and her duration and nothing else. Adeline stood at the grave for a long moment. She had brought one of the architectural drawings, the 1889 draft, the first sheet, the one that showed the initial site plan with the building footprint and the approach drive, and the east window drawn in at the very first pass before any other detail had been resolved. She had noticed the margin note on this sheet the night before, during her second pass through the drawings at her kitchen table, and had sat with it for a long time before she understood fully what she was reading. It was a small notation written in pencil beside the east window placement, the kind of note an architect makes for herself rather than for anyone else, a reminder of intent, a record of the reason behind a decision. Morning light here. This is where she will want to read. Adeline unfolded the drawing at the grave and found the notation and read it aloud. Her voice held steady through most of it. She drove back along the county road as the afternoon light began to angle lower, the October sky doing what October skies do, going gold at the edges before it went dark. She came over the rise where the road curved north, and Colston House appeared on the hill to her left, the stone facade catching the late light, the east elevation visible from this angle. She pulled to the shoulder without deciding to. The east window, the one Vivian had drawn into every single draft from the first sheet in 1889, always in the same position, always annotated with the same intention. Morning light here was visible from the road at this distance. The lace curtains that had been hanging in it since before anyone living could remember moved slightly in the breeze that was coming up with the evening. Vivian's curtains, still there. Adeline sat on the shoulder of the road and looked at the window in the fading light for a long time. Then she put the car in gear and drove toward home. She made the 4 calls on a Monday morning. She had written the numbers in her notepad the night before the County Historical Society, the State Architectural Registry, the Recorder's Office, the stonemason on Millbrook Road, whose work she had seen on 3 other restoration projects, and whose name she had kept in her files for the kind of occasion she had not been able to name at the time, but had understood she would eventually need. She made the calls in order from the most procedural to the most particular, the way she had always worked through a complex task. Established the official record, first then moved to meaning. The recorder's office was first. She had spoken with Anne Fielding twice already during the title research, and Anne received the formal submission with the same careful neutrality she brought to everything, the 1891 original deed, the architectural drawings, the forged 1895 transfer document from Norbert's wooden box, and Claudia's written analysis of the signature discrepancy. Anne reviewed the submission summary on the phone with the focused attention of someone who understood what she was looking at and what it required of her. The 1895 transfer would be flagged in the county title record, she said. A historical annotation, not a legal reversal which was beyond the recorder's office to effect for a transaction more than a century old, but a permanent notation in the chain of title indicating that the transfer had been contested on the basis of a forged signature, and that the original 1891 deed recorded Vivian Rose Colston as the sole legal owner at the time of first occupancy. The record would reflect the truth. That was what the record was for. The State Architectural Registry was second. The submission there required the architectural drawings, the deed establishing Vivian as the property owner, and a formal letter of attribution from a qualified historian. Claudia had written it the previous week, 4 pages, the documentation precise and complete. The registry officer reviewed the submission over the phone with Adeline and asked 2 clarifying questions about the dating of the drawings before confirming that the attribution would be processed. Colston House, Ashwood Hill, designed and financed by Vivian Rose Colston, 1889 to 1891. Her name, in the official record of the state's architectural heritage, permanent. The Historical Society submission was third, a parallel registration, the same documentation the Society's own record amended to read Colston House, established 1891, Vivian Rose Colston architect and original owner. The Society's director had called back within the hour to say that the submission had been accepted and that the Society wished to discuss a permanent display of the original drawings when Adeline was ready. Adeline said she would call her after the gathering. The stonemason was fourth. She described what she needed: small, she said, appropriate to the entrance rather than monumental. Brass mounted at eye level beside the front door where anyone arriving at the house would read it before they crossed the threshold. The text was specific, and she read it to him twice to make sure it was exact. Vivian Rose Colston, architect and builder, 1889 to 1891. He had it ready in 10 days. The gathering was small. Adeline had not wanted a ceremony. She had used that word deliberately when she spoke with Claudia and with the Historical Society director, in the same way she imagined Vivian would have used it if she had been consulted on the question. Not a ceremony, a gathering. The distinction mattered. A ceremony was for the people attending a performance of significance. What this required was simply the right people in the right place for the right reason. Claudia came. Norbert came alone in his dark blue sedan, parking on the road's shoulder, the way he had every morning for the first week. 2 county historians who had been following the documentation since Claudia first brought the case to the Historical Society. A reporter from the local paper, Young, who stood at the edge of the group and wrote in a small notebook and understood without being told that this was not a story about conflict or scandal, but about a name being returned to where it had always belonged. The stonemason had mounted the plaque the morning before. It was at eye level beside the front door, exactly as Adeline had specified. Small, clean, the brass warm in the October light, the letters precise and permanent. Vivian Rose Colston, architect and builder, 1889 to 1891. They stood at the entrance for a moment reading it. Then they went inside. In the east parlor, Vivian's portrait was on the mantel above the fireplace she had drawn into every draft. The architectural drawings were spread on the table under the east window, the morning light falling across them at the angle she had calculated in 1889. Adeline stood at the table and read from Vivian's handwritten note, not all of it, just the lines that needed to be spoken in this room, in this light. "I built this house. It was mine. I want it known." She read it at the pace Vivian had written it, plainly without performance, the way you read something that does not require emphasis because it carries its own. Norbert stood near the back wall. He had not spoken during the gathering. He had stood with his hands folded and looked at the plaque and looked at the portrait on the mantel and looked at the drawings on the table, and his expression throughout was the expression she had seen at the gate when she told him about the initials under the banister, the weight settling into a different shape, not lifting but finding ground. When she read Vivian's note aloud, Norbert looked at the floor. He held his eyes there for a long moment. After the others had gone, Norbert stayed briefly. He told Adeline that he had written a statement of formal written acknowledgement of Burton Ray's actions submitted to the Historical Society for their permanent record. He had not been asked to do this. He said this plainly without seeking credit for it. It needed to be in the record, he said. His name is in the record. What he did should be there too. Adeline thanked him. He drove away down the hill and she watched his car until it was gone. She went back inside alone. She descended to the cellar and stood at the passage entrance for a long time. The tunnel was visible beyond the opening, the narrow stone corridor, the lantern light she had left on at the far end still burning the warm amber glow, reaching back through the 40 feet of passage to where she stood. She did not seal it. She left the entrance standing open carefully, deliberately, the way you leave a door open when you want the room beyond it to be part of the house rather than separate from it. Vivian had not hidden those documents expecting to be rescued. She had been past rescue in 1895. The transfer was filed. The lawyer's letter was written. She had sat on the step of her own house for an hour while Burton Ray did not answer, and then she had left. She had known when she went into the tunnel and sealed the tin box in the alcove that she was not leaving a message for someone who would come in time to help her. She was leaving a message for someone who would come later, decades out, maybe much longer, and would care enough to go all the way into the dark and bring what was there back into the light. She had been right. Adeline went upstairs to the east parlor and sat in the chair nearest the window. The morning light came through the glass at the angle Vivian had calculated in 1889, the center window slightly larger than the flanking two, the placement deliberate, the intention recorded in a margin note on the first architectural draft. Morning light here. This is where she will want to read. Vivian's portrait was on the mantel, composed, certain, looking directly forward from the brass oval frame, the same expression she had worn when she stood at the front entrance in 1892 and had her photograph taken with the stone facade and the east window arch visible behind her, because she had understood even then that the record of her standing there mattered. The architectural drawings were spread on the table. The same room, the same light, the same chair.
Adeline sat in the light Vivian had designed for someone to sit in the room Vivian had drawn from the first draft, and looked at the portrait of the woman who had built all of it, and lost all of it, and trusted without any evidence that the trust was warranted except her own certainty that someone would come.
She built this house so that someone could sit in this light in this room on a morning just like this one. I think she always knew it would be a stranger. I think she built it for all of us. If Vivian's story stayed with you, subscribe and leave a comment. Tell me what would you have done if you'd found that tin box in the tunnel.